They are Owen Garriott and Richard Garriott. Owen was one of the 6 scientist astronauts selected by NASA, and he flew in the Skylab 3 mission in 1973 and in the Spacelab 1 mission in 1983. His more recent work has included expeditions to collect and study extremophile bacteria and other organisms from harsh environments such as alkaline lakes and deep-sea hydrothermal vents. And some of that work was done in association with the Laboratory of Structural Biology at the University of Alabama here in Huntsville. Richard Garriott is the well-known video game developer and founder of Origin Systems in Austin, Texas. He flew on a Russian Soyuz to the International Space Station on October the 12th, 2008, self-funded, and returned to Earth 12 days later. Richard works to provide private space flights as vice chairman of Space Adventures, and he's a trustee of X Prize and a co-founder of Zero Gravity Corporation, a company that provides zero-G flights and aircraft. Please welcome Owen and Richard Garriott.
Thank you very much. And first of all, thank you all very much for inviting us out here today. You know, it's actually great for us to speak together with so many of our peers and colleagues in this rapidly changing industry. I don't really need to, I was going to introduce my father actually there as kind of part of my thing too. I was making sure, but you actually covered it pretty darn well, that even though we've now both flown in space, we have come to this with very different routes. You know, my father through what I'll call the original traditional methods, the only methods that existed at the time, and myself having grown up in and around this industry for so many years, but was told at a young age that I would be ineligible, and so therefore I devoted myself to finding alternative methods to pull off that dream, and ultimately pulled it off. So today we are going to talk to you a little bit about some of the goals and methods for human spaceflight. You know, where we've been, where we are, and how we might kind of continue to do this in the future. And so I'm going to first invite my father Owen to speak first. And here, for convenience.
Thank you, Richard. And very pleased to see Dr. Money at the podium here. I was not aware you were going to be available. Oops, that's the wrong spot. Maybe this will be a little better, Ken. But Ken and I worked together on Spacelab, what was it, 30 years ago, starting something like that. And so it's an opportunity to get back together. And if there's any way to lower the volume on this microphone, I think it'll be very helpful for all of us. If not, I'll move it away completely and use this portable one. Is there anyone?
I think you're doing fine now. Keep that close to you with the microphone.
Well, we'll give it a try, but that's apt to make it. Well, we'll give it a try. We'll give it a try. At any rate, there are a lot of heavy lift vehicles that are going to be potentially in our future. However, that's not the end of the issue. For example, the question comes about when? When is this heavy lift vehicle that we see over on the screen going to be into our future? That's only one of the questions, and it depends on who you ask as to what answer you will get. Some people who are responsible for writing budgets and so forth, plans will say 2016. And if you ask the NASA people, they will usually say, well, that's what's on the books. However, we aren't going to be able to have it ready by that date. And more than that, we aren't going to have the money to pay for it by that date. But the government will say, I'm sorry, it's on the books. You're obligated to provide this to us by 2016. Well, that's a nice obligation to make, but it's like an obligation for your house or your car. If you don't have the money in the bank, they may not get the obligation completed. And so there's problems with some of the issues about heavy lift vehicles. And so when is certainly one of those. And the other important thing, I think, is for what purpose? What purpose are we going to use this magnificent vehicle that can hoist something 130, 160 tons into space? We certainly don't want to, in a way like space station, have a space station which has taken 20 years, roughly, or more, and some $50 to $100 billion to complete, and then find all of a sudden we have shorted ourselves in terms of providing something to do in that magnificent laboratory. And so we need to be thinking about what is the purpose of providing this kind of a vehicle? What are we going to do with it once we have it, whether it's in 2016 or 2020 or whenever it does become available? So there are some issues involved with the kinds of things that we hear bandied about in the press. There are lots of things we can do with a vehicle like that, and we want to be thinking those at the same time. We're thinking about how do we provide the vehicle. We better be thinking about what are we going to do with it, for example, in low Earth orbit, if anything, certainly not to carry crew members back and forth. We don't want that vehicle for that purpose. But certainly for interplanetary voyages, could be to asteroids. And if we think a little further into interplanetary space, my argument would be that we ought to be thinking of things like Phobos and Deimos as moons of Mars rather than going to the surface of Mars. You may have be familiar with the work of Fred Singer, and I've known Fred Singer something like 40 years or so, and he's got a very interesting biography if you have a chance to take a look at it. But he was one of the first to, I think, to call it a PhD program. In other words, for Fred, it's the Phobos or Deimos program. And Phobos and Deimos has a number of very interesting aspects as a target for our first voyages to the vicinity of Mars. For example, the surface gravity on Mars is roughly, it's less than 1 milli-G. And with 1 milli-G, you can easily shove yourself off, and you need to be careful that you don't do it too hard, or else you might sail a little further away than you had thought. And so that's certainly one interesting thing about going there first. Great observatory for controlling robots on the surface of Mars. You don't have to worry about dropping into a deep gravitational well, including the atmosphere that Mars has. And so it's certainly an advantage to stop on Phobos and Deimos and do a lot of laboratory work. You can probably go outside very carefully and actually, perhaps tethered as a matter of fact, and bring back rocks on the surface of Phobos or Deimos, which are probably from the surface of Mars itself. And so if you want to study Mars, there's good reason to look on Phobos or Deimos first and do laboratory work while you're there, then communicate with ground in real time, do the analysis of some of those rocks, and lay your plans for the next steps while you're there. So Phobos and Deimos, I think, are two very good targets. Asteroids are certainly a target, and there are a number of those. But one other thing that I haven't mentioned has been studied at some length, but it does not, I think, get adequate sort of coverage in the press as a use for that kind of a vehicle, and that would be as a vehicle to carry nuclear machinery, could be the rocket, into space for use on transiting with crews all throughout the solar system. Now, there have been several suggestions of plasma engines. I think of one that Chang Diaz calls VASIMR, variable amplitude space, something I can't remember that full acronym for VASIMR at the moment, but the point is it's a plasma engine that's throttleable, that you can vary the amount of thrust, and it will reduce the transit time for whatever you're carrying, either mass, a cargo, or a crew carrier, to the vicinity of Mars in much less than the 6 to 9 months that would typically be required for chemical rockets. And so I think something like a VASIMR or another plasma engine could be one of the objects that you would want to make use here. Well, those we need to think about these kinds of things, how we're going to make use of a heavy vehicle like this when we finally get it available to us. Now, what's the logical procedure that one should go through in deciding how we're going to use it? Well, first of all, from my perspective, you first of all need to decide what you're going to do. What do you want to do with it? Like the ones we've just been talking about. Not build it first and then say, oh yes, now what shall I use it for? That is inverted logic. And at the best, certainly you should be thinking of it in parallel. You should not be deciding on the designs until you know what you're going to use it for. And so that's not something that NASA has always followed in the past. And there are some perfectly good reasons that they didn't have the money to do two things in parallel and so on. But particularly when we're talking about the numbers associated with a heavy lift vehicle like this, you'd ought to be thinking about what kind of object are you going to have to use before you start designing it. Certainly, those are the kinds of things that we're going to need to think about in terms of having it ready for us, and what kind of experiments are you going to want to do on board. For the ISS, we've thought about the experiments, but we managed to not get them funded properly because we did not go through that logical procedure of deciding how we were going to use the ISS before we spent 20 years and $50 billion or more putting it together. Well, we'd want to make those mistakes again. One other thing I want to point out before I give it back here to Richard to talk about is the vehicles to carry the crews. I call it a crew transfer vehicle, obviously not this very heavy lift vehicle, far too much capability than just for the crew transport. But we now have essentially reached the end point of our shuttle, one more flight, 1.5 more flights, let's say. The last half is very important as well, of that STS-134, and then one more flight after that. But we have lots of options for transport now from crews from the surface up to the ISS. Orion is the one that NASA is working on, and I'm very hopeful that it is successful and does very well with a substantial crew and is available on time as soon as we have a transport vehicle to carry it. But it's not the only one. SpaceX has developed the Dragon vehicle, and it is one that is also intended to carry crews back and forth. Sierra Nevada has a lifting body, which looks very nice. It's an aerodynamic shape that has been tested and thought through by NASA for a very long period. And there are still even more than that. I'm not sure we need 5 versions of a crew transport vehicle. And so it's another thing that we should be thinking about right now. Which one or several of these, but probably not 5 versions do we want, and which vehicles can carry the majority of these? We don't want, I wouldn't think if I were leading one of those companies, that I would want a crew transport vehicle that could only take my special special crew carrier, because for some reason, maybe it didn't have the right GPS or the right communication system, or it was not solar powered, whereas that's what they needed, and have my whole effort cut short simply because I could not accept somebody else's crew compartment. And so I think we need to be thinking very carefully about what do we need in the way of crew transport vehicle to carry people between the Earth and the space station. I don't think we need all 5, and so that's one of the other things that our people within NASA and on the commercial side outside of the government at this point need to be thinking about what is the logical way to proceed to make use of a heavy lift vehicle and a crew transport vehicle that will be used to carry people back and forth to the space station. Well, I know that Richard has a lot of things to talk about in terms of how we make use of the other commercial carriers, and so why don't I stop right here and let you finish with Jim, Richard.
You know, so as I look back at the 50 years of the space program we had, I mean, I know a lot of you that are of my generation would probably feel very similarly about the early inspiration of the first decade or two of starting with what I'll call the Apollo era. And a lot of us believed that the 2001 style Kubrick vision of the future was going to be true. It was sort of the manifest destiny of our generation to be living and working in space and living in these, wagon wheel style space stations. And I'm sure many of us share the disappointment that we haven't quite reached there yet, and are still passionately working to make this eventually come true. But it's interesting also to reflect that, during those first 10 years, to see how much happened. I mean, the first decade we went from, decade and a half anyway, went from living bounded here on the Earth to putting first objects in space, then ourselves in space, then ultimately reaching the moon. But since then, we still have only just passed 500 people ever in the history of humanity in space. And you look at that and you go, okay, well, why is that, and what and how can we do about it? And I think that, if you analyze it and you go, look, space today still remains very expensive, and it remains very dangerous, and either one, and especially both of those, means that it shouldn't be any surprise that therefore it's pretty darn uncommon. But I believe that equation is what's so important to change, and I believe we've recently started the path to fundamentally change that paradigm. You add to that the fact that the space station right now cost us so much time and money to get into space, to put it there, and still at this moment costs us so much time and money to leave in space, And as an entrepreneur, as a businessman, as somebody that even if you get the profit motive out of it, which is a pretty good motive, but even if you just look at what I'll call fundamental research you can do at a laboratory at this cost, it's still fundamentally very hard. It's hard to justify work that is this expensive. And if you look back, for example, at the previous Constellation plan to go back to the Moon and Mars, I think if you look at the way that plan went, I think from a technical standpoint, the plan was quite sound. I was pretty excited about seeing it come into existence. But it's probably no surprise that due to the extraordinary high cost over multiple decades to increase your budget over 4 or 5 or 6 political administrations that would be required to pull it off meant that it was again, shouldn't be too surprising. We not only didn't finish it, frankly, we never really started it from a budgeting standpoint. But I do believe that, while I know that lots of people, and especially actually in this town, the people who are local to this town, I know are feeling the pain as much as anywhere else about the upheaval in our industry, I really sincerely believe we are at the beginning of a new, grand era of space exploration. And I believe this era sort of began with the inspiration of Apollo. And those same people that were inspired by Apollo, even though we're not already living on space stations, a huge number of people that were inspired by Apollo went off to private industry. And it's interesting to note that the big tech boom we went through came right on the heels of Apollo. And I don't think that's an accident. I believe there is a causal association associated with the fact that the first decade did such a great job of inspiring all of us to get into science, technology, engineering, and math. And it's interesting to see how many of us are returning now to the space industry, and those of us haven't been there for our whole careers, in order to try to manifest that destiny we were taught to believe in. And I know you're all familiar with what I'll call the, for people doing serious orbital work, might think of as the younger child of the family, the suborbital activities. But the first big success I do think came with the X Prize. Not only that we now have suborbital vehicles in development, like Branson, who bought Burt Rattan's original vehicle. My personal favorite, and one that my company Space Adventures has put money behind, is John Carmack's Armadillo Aerospace. This vehicle that he built, while he invented some great new technology like the rocket nozzle, pretty much any high school or college team that can do a first robotics entry these days can spend about $250,000 and go build a rocket that will fly into space. I mean, that is a fundamentally different paradigm than it was 20 years ago. Space, just the first step on the journey to space is a heck of a lot easier than it was just a decade or two back. And all these people doing suborbital, including John, this is the vehicle that's under construction now, which will hopefully be the vehicle that we fly passengers with. Even after this flies, all these suborbital people have their eyes on what's next, and they also plan to go to orbit also. Everybody here, as I'm sure, familiar with Blue Origin. I'm not sure what their ongoing suborbital plans are, but they'll come back up here again on the orbital side. I just got a newsletter 2 days ago, I think, from the X-Corps folks, many of whom are in the room, with some great new progress they've just had on their journey to make their space plane. I mean, this is moving very, very quickly, and I think we're literally on just a couple years away from what I would describe as the barnstorming era of suborbital, and I mean that in the safest possible context. Because a lot of people, when I've mentioned that, kind of say, barnstorming wasn't that safe, but really, I think that it's going to be a very exciting period to see how the general public, the much less wealthy than is required as a business or a country or an ultra-wealthy person to go to orbit, this is really something lots of people will partake in, I believe. But really, to do serious work in space, you have to at least get to low Earth orbit, and that also, I think, is really changing a lot. Dad already mentioned the Falcon 9, and although I know a lot of you know it, it shocks me how little of the general public knows that last November a private rocket was launched that took a capsule that also re-entered and was recovered. I mean, to me, that's probably most, in the recent history of space, that's by far the biggest milestone that the general public is largely unaware of. And I'm kind of leaping ahead in my talk, but I think one of the reasons that it's people aren't as well aware of it is that as we are right now, what I'll call government space and commercial space, especially from a public perception, seem to be in conflict with each other. And that's absolutely not true. You know, commercial space is government space. You know, the Falcon 9 is not being built to take tourists or other private citizens. This is being built for NASA missions, and so this is a NASA plan. And I'll come back to it. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself as I'm saying about kind of this public-private partnership that I believe is that we're in that we're going into right now. And you know, the same thing is true with you know, all these same prime contractors that you know, I know there's been a lot of talk about human certifying the Atlas and the Delta, and in my mind, the debates about how and why to do it are often misguided in the sense of what you really want is statistical safety. You really don't care how you get there. And we already have a pretty darn good statistical track record for these vehicles right here. And so people ought to just, you know, get off the historical methods of interpreting and managing and controlling and red taping safety certification and find a way to drive to the statistical result you're looking for, and then let the cards fall where they do. And what you'll find is you get, thank you. You'll get the results much quicker and much cheaper and much safer than you would if you try to put other roadblocks in the way. You know, this, you know, I think no one would argue that Boeing's not going to be able to make a good spacecraft. They've already made so many in their time before. And, you know, Boeing is now another partner of Space Adventures, my company. We are their commercial reseller into the private market. And what I find interesting about that is that, you know, Boeing might fly, you know, nominally 4 flights a year, we'll say, for NASA. And Space Adventures might be able to fly 1. But if we can even fly 1, that's a 20% increase in their bottom line and their flight frequency, which means the price goes down for everyone, safety goes up for everyone. And so, again, I would say don't look at even the private flyers as competition. Think of them as an increase in flight rate, which is good for everybody. You know, I'm personally happen to be a big fan of the Sierra Nevada concept. I think a lifting body is a particularly comfortable and good way to bring cargo and some experiments back down from orbit. If I can't even tell, that's the Blue Origin vehicle that also, as you all know, has received some funding. And so if I go back again now, you look at, you know, you go, okay, well now I can at least get my crews up and down in a way that, you know, it shouldn't be thought of as competition, should be thought of as part of the NASA plan. Well, now what am I going to do on orbit? Now, you know, I tried to do work on orbit myself, by the way, and ran into how phenomenally expensive it is to be a private person to try to buy any service on the space station. I mean, it is shockingly expensive to even borrow an ice cube, you know, for example. And so there's no, in my mind, there is no commercial work that will be easily done on that. And the whole idea of making this a national laboratory, while wonderful in theory, has to have some, again, complete overhaul in the way that people think about financially handing that cost accounting down to private consumers. Thank you. And by the way, if you don't, then nobody's going to use it, and instead everybody's going to go here. And they're going to go over to Bob Bigelow's private orbital laboratories. As you all probably know, he's already got 2 modules in orbit right now. He's preparing to send a full-scale version. And again, it's going to come with a much lower, what I'll call, overhead. And so I think, I'm a big fan of the ISS. I just want to make sure we find a way to charge for it that gives it actual utilization versus tries to cover all our sunk costs of inefficiently putting it there. And now I'm back to the whole point about this plan. The new plan is a NASA plan. And I think that the place that it's really gone awry, when I'm also on the NASA Advisory Council, and when I was at, I'm on the Education and Public Outreach segment, and one of the things that the public outreach people were lamenting is at the last Dragon flight, how the agreements between NASA and SpaceX allowed SpaceX to keep the NASA cameras out of the launch site during the launch. And while I can, on the one hand, I'm a good friend of Elon's, I understand why Elon's going like, in case something goes wrong, I don't necessarily want to have the full crush of the usual general public there to catch us with our pants down, so to speak. But on the other hand, that exacerbates, to my mind, the fact that nobody thinks of this as a NASA event, when it is. I mean, if you think about, in fact, if you look at, think about the Spirit and Opportunity up roving on Mars. No one on Earth would ever think of that as anything other than a NASA mission. But it was launched on a private Delta rocket as a commercial payload like any other commercial payload. And yet it would never even cross your mind to think of it as not a NASA mission. And that same thing must be true of everything, including like the Dragon launch. The Falcon and the Dragon. These commercial launches are NASA business. They need to be embraced as NASA business. They need to be marketed to the public as NASA business. And I think only with we'll call that very strong public-private partnership will we really move confidently forward into the future. Thank you. And and so to that end, I think space ultimately really has to be responsible for creating measurable value back to those of us who are investing in it as taxpayers, or especially if you want commerce to follow behind. I mean, I think that NASA has to lead the charge and be the people out in front doing exploration and fundamental scientific research that's just good for our country or the globe as a whole. But the only reason to continue to go back and forth to any place repeatedly is because there's commercial value there. And so we need to be organizing it such that we leave equipment and capabilities behind that are relevant and possible for commercial users. And here's what gives me so much hope that the price really can drop as much as a lot of these new entrepreneurs claim. If you look at every other form of mature transport, planes, cars, boats, and trains, all of those cost to operate approximately 3 times the amount of energy that it takes to make them go. And so that's true for all of these. Your insurance and maintenance costs you about 3 times the energy. But of course rockets are very much not that way. Rockets are a couple hundred times the energy cost to operate. And the number one reason in my mind is because as soon as you finish operating the rocket, you generally crush it and go buy another. Well, imagine if every time you filled up your car with gas, you crushed it and bought another. Well, not very many people would drive at that point. And that's even with a car that's built on an assembly line, so it's pretty darn cheap, relatively speaking, but you still wouldn't. It'd still be prohibitive. And so the first thing we've got to do is get true full reusability out of our vehicles. And that's how we're going to go from a shuttle era system where it takes us hundreds of millions of dollars per person to fly into space. While that's retiring, there's a lot of people lamenting our dependence upon the Soyuz, but frankly, the Soyuz, at only tens of millions of dollars and 100 times better safety, and also being very plentiful versus only one left, makes the Soyuz a pretty darn good option for right now. And so as opposed to people, kind of lamenting that dependence, just use it. I mean, the Russians are not bad folks. I mean, I know a lot of them, and they're pretty good to work with, and I think that we can be quite successful while utilizing their tools in the meantime. But pretty quickly, we need to get start building our own domestic capabilities. But the great thing about all these domestic capabilities is whether you're traditional aerospace, quote unquote, or this new breed of commercial, quote unquote. Most everybody I talk to believes that in the span of a few generations of vehicles, not the vehicles being built today, but the subsequent set of vehicles, they can get the price to launch a human mass into space on a vehicle that's human rated is into the single-digit millions. And what's important about single-digit millions is that I believe that is where space will truly explode as far as what kind of activities are happening in space. I myself paid tens of millions for my own trip to space, so I was looking really hard to find work I could do in space to offset that terrific price. And while I didn't offset tens of millions, I did offset millions. And so if we get the price down into the millions, we suddenly get to the point where, frankly, I would have made money in space. And if I can make money in space, first, I'm going every chance I get. And secondly, I'll bet most of you will too. And that means other businesses and entrepreneurs and private individuals do the same. And so I believe we're really right at the cusp of making that become true. And I know, lots of people who have invested vast amounts of money behind vehicles and strategies that they believe will pull this off. And I believe it too. And so then if you're going to do work in space, of course, you're going to say, well, what are those businesses? What are the ways they're going to first make money? I think any great business or any compelling business is going to solve some great problem of the human condition or improve life here on Earth. I think the 3 areas of low-hanging fruit are biological activity. I did some myself with some protein crystal growth. There's another company that grew out of SpaceHab called Astrotech that is doing vaccine development. There's a lot of talk about space-based solar power. The Japanese are investing a huge amount in this. Theirs is my worry about the Japanese plan is it's sort of like our constellation plan. It's very expensive and it's very large scale, so I think it's going to be therefore very difficult to continue moving forward on step by step. I'm a much bigger fan of solar power you can launch in one launch and then beam power to place on Earth. It will still be expensive per kilowatt power, but there are places that like military front lines where if you could beam power to them and save the safety and cost of convoys through the desert, still be very, very valuable. So that's kind of my favorite on the solar power standpoint. And then as my dad was referring to too, I think, and I've seen a number of people, and I know there's some talks even over the last couple of days, I think the potential value of rare metals and things off the surface of asteroids is also something that could turn out to be exceptionally valuable. And of course, as you all are well aware, there's a vast number of targets in space that have these small gravity wells to go visit and extract value from, hopefully. And so again, this public-private partnership is what I think is so critical. Some of you may know that Space Adventures, my own company, has just sold our first circumlunar seat. We have to sell a second actually before it will fly, but where there's one, there's many. And so, or at least a couple, I hope. But the point is, I think there's very good odds that the first visitors back to the moon are actually going to be private. It's not even going to be a government expedition. I think the same thing's true on the surface of the moon. I think the next vehicle that will literally physically be touching on the surface of the moon might actually be represented out here in the halls by some of the teams that are competing for the Google Lunar X Prize. I think I don't know of any other what I'll call government plans anywhere on the globe that within, say, 5 or 8 years will likely have a rover on the surface of the moon. And I think that's good because that's, again, private industry coming in behind the already existing exploration to find out if and how to create value out of those places. And instead, while NASA, I believe, should be the first expedition to, for example, an asteroid or to Phobos and Deimos, I don't think any private expedition would even, frankly, I've never even heard anybody discuss trying to be the first, at least to me, especially with humans. So that's a great place for NASA to provide leadership. And then once we know what's there and if it's actually of value and how the process is, how you dock with it, anchor to it, what percentage of value is there and how you might potentially extract it, bring back that knowledge, hand that knowledge over to private industry, and then let private industry get to work and see if they can make a business out of it. I even think, even if we go as far as putting boots on the ground on Mars, I'm a Buzz Aldrin follower on plans to how to get to Mars, in the sense of I think any giant 30-year plan with giant budgets is largely doomed to failure, just because I think political reality won't sustain it. And so I think we need to pick our targets to be decadal at best, because you're already going through 2.5 political cycles at that point, and that's pretty hard to maintain. And so my plan for how to get us back to Mars is to use something like the Google X Prize, or maybe Google will do it again, the Google Martian X Prize that I'll announce here today that they haven't agreed to. When we get a prize, to put rovers on Mars, you stack a series of prizes where one sequesters oxygen, one builds radiation hardened igloos, one stores fuel, one makes a greenhouse. And once you have enough, supplies that have been sequestered there on the surface for what I'll call habitats, which can be the things that keep us busy for as many decades as it takes, hopefully one, but however long it takes, it's all right. And then only after you have a place to go visit do you send crews there one way, and if that's what's required. And I think you get plenty of volunteers, many in this room, I expect. So, in any case, the way I'm going to wrap up is I just want to send a shout out to STS-134. The two other Americans I flew on the space station with are up there now. Hello to Greg and Mike and the rest of the crew. Thanks for letting me spend so much time with you. And then my last slide I want to point out is how, if you look at the space agencies of Earth, there are 27 countries and agencies that have put people into space so far, and Space Adventures is the 6th largest out of 27 space agencies on Earth. And so that's just an example of how the world is truly changing. So thanks. Well, I think we have time for a couple questions if you'd like, or did you have something else you wanted to do?
No, questions are great.
Okay. Do we generate any questions out of all that? Yeah. Yeah, so the question is, how do we sustain continuity through political cycles as to what our vision for space exploration is?
I was going to repeat the question and let you answer it.
I beat you to it. Well, so I actually think that, I think the main issue for me is to make sure you don't go beyond a decade. So one is you have to pick as short a cycle thing as you can. But there is a second one, too, which is to get, as much as possible, remove what I'll call political objectives out of it, and as much as possible put scientific or commercial objectives into it. If you have a sound logic as to why that is truly the next step, then people can remain rallied behind it. The problem we have is that even in this room, if we go, where do you want to go next? Should we stage at the moon? Should we stage in low Earth orbit? Should we stage on a low gravity well? Do we really want to go to the big objective and get to the Mars or further as fast as we can? There's going to be debate in this room, even as to how to pull that off. And so to the degree you're leaning on political cycles, they've got to be short or it won't survive. To the degree that you can find a compelling scientific or business case for it, you can probably expand that vision a little longer.
I think we had had the best food in space 35 years back on Skylab, because Skylab had excellent food, better than the succeeding shuttle flights by all means, and it was for the one reason they spent a lot of money on it. It was one of the major scientific experiments to see exactly how much food each individual would consume, how it was metabolized, and how it was excreted. And as a matter of fact, to do that, I'll take it just a little bit longer because it's a very interesting question that Ken may know more about as well. But they had about 65 or 70 different menu items. They were going to feed 3,500 calories to everybody, regardless of their size. My partner, Jack Lausma, at about 200, myself at about 145, we were all going to get 3,500 calories. Now, that didn't make a lot of sense. But they thought everyone would need the same. They said, well, in space you don't do that much work, so we'll drop it to 3,000. Well, that didn't solve the problem either. And so finally we convinced them and they modified the program so that we got something more proportional to our initial body mass. Also, it's very true that you do end up consuming roughly about the same amount in space that you do here on ground. So the important thing was to think through the program at the beginning very carefully, and then be willing to spend the money that allows you to get the proper kinds of items on your menu. We had lobster Newburg, filet mignon like we had lunch today. Spoiled. It wasn't that good on Space Lab. But spending that kind of money enables you to do an excellent experiment and had also very good quality response from all of the crew members. So that's the way I would do it, like you did on Skylab 35 years ago.
I think so. So I'm still one of the trustees of the X Prize. And we just, 2 or 3 weeks ago, we had our annual meeting where we get together and kind of all argue about what should the next X Prize be. And space-based solar power did not make the final cut, although that was one of the ones I was also lobbying for. But I actually I'm a devout believer in what I'll call the prize model. I think it's proven out very well to show that for a much more modest price, you can get 10 or 100-fold or better private money to invest in solving any big problem you believe is solvable. In our case, for the X Prize, part of our criteria is that we think it has to be won in fairly short order. Something that is we're 3-ish years out from being able to have the prize won, and that's been debated.
Also a contribution on that. I think there's a halfway steps, and I bet you didn't discuss it at the X Prize.
Power beaming?
No. Reflectors, space reflectors,
no.
Because there's all sorts of people who need light at night. And if you can put up your reflectors so that you just have a big mirror and you can illuminate New York City, San Francisco, whatever you want, you can replace a lot of the power that goes into the nighttime illumination of these cities. And so I think that would exercise a lot of the activity that would be required for an eventual electrical power system that sends the electromagnetic energy back down. And so that's an intermediate step, wouldn't be nearly as expensive, and they ought to consider that as an X Prize.
I'll bring you to the next X Prize meeting. So. Okay, back here in the front. So here's some help you guys can give me if anybody has some ties in NASA to help me twist some arms. So first of all, I agree with you. Mike Fink is a great ambassador of space, as is Greg for that matter too. They both enjoy that so much. It's unbelievable.
He was just talking to him by email 2 days ago.
Praying while he was up. Yeah, and well, what was interesting is Alan Bean, who flew with my dad and also back to the moon before that, when he saw the press release of my flight, he sent me a very nice letter basically saying, "Hey, Richard, congratulations. I know it's something I've known you since you were a kid, and you've been trying to pull this off since then. So hey, it's great that you finally got the chance." He then also said, it's really great that you personally are going. And he said the reason why it's great that you are going versus my dad and myself, being Alan, he said, your dad and I were hired because we're super scientists and test pilots for many astronauts of the early era. But he said, but you're an artist, you're a communicator, and since Alan's an artist too, he could, obviously relate. And he said, what's really great about you going is you will come back and speak more passionately and openly about this than for example, it used to be like pulling teeth to get this guy to go talk to the press or public in any way, shape, or form. I used to have kids come and ask me, oh, your dad's an astronaut. Oh, did he tell you how cool it was to go in space? And I'd go, well, no, he actually never talked about that. So I'd go home and ask my dad, hey, Dad, was it cool to go in space? And he'd go, it's nominal, a lot like the training. That's true.
I don't think so.
It's true.
I don't think so.
It's true. And so I think it is important these new ambassadors come up, but here's the arm twisting you can do. So I filmed a 5-minute movie in space called Apogee of Fear that we filmed in one take with my crewmates. The total time I interfered with the professional going-ons of space was negligible, and we did it after dinner on our own private time anyway. Which the Smithsonian has heard about, and the Smithsonian wants me to put in the Smithsonian as the first science fiction movie ever made in space, but NASA won't let me release it to the public because they consider it off their messaging target. So I have this movie made. Anybody that can help me convince the powers that be, write to your senators, write to your congressmen, write to your leaders of the NASA, release Apogee of Fear. And if you want to see it, by the way, you can come see me and I'll show you. But, yeah. Well, I'm a believer that anything that mathematically works will eventually work. So hypothetically, wormholes someday might work, but it will take the destruction of a planet to power it if it's feasible at all. It's clearly not happening anytime soon. And my fear about space elevators is that, again, it mathematically works, so in theory it could eventually work, but I don't think we're very close. I think the engineering problems that have to be solved and the deployment problems that have to be solved are, I think, still enormous. Although I have a variation on it that I'm a fan of, which is instead of deploying a cable all the way to the ground, just deploy the cable to 100 kilometers above the surface of the Earth so you don't even come in the atmosphere, and then use one of these suborbital hoppers like John Carmack's to jump up to it and grab on. And that way you get a kind of hybrid. But I still think it's very far away, I think. Okay, well, thank you again very much. Thanks, Tim.
They are Owen Garriott and Richard Garriott. Owen was one of the 6 scientist astronauts selected by NASA, and he flew in the Skylab 3 mission in 1973 and in the Spacelab 1 mission in 1983. His more recent work has included expeditions to collect and study extremophil bacteria and other organisms from harsh environments such as alkaline lakes and deep-sea hydrothermal vents. And some of that work was done in association with the Laboratory of Structural Biology at the University of Alabama here in Huntsville. Richard Garriott is the well-known video game developer and founder of Origin Systems in Austin, Texas. He flew on a Russian Soyuz to the International Space Station on October the 12th, 2008, self-funded, and returned to Earth 12 days later. Richard works to provide private space flights as vice chairman of Space Adventures, and he's a trustee of X Prize and a co-founder of Zero Gravity Corporation, a company that provides zero-G flights and aircraft. Please welcome Owen and Richard Garriott.
Thank you very much. And first of all, thank you all very much for inviting us out here today. It's actually great for us to...
If not, I'll move it away completely and use this portable one. Is there anyone...
I think you're doing fine now. Keep that close to you.
Well, we'll give it a try, but that's apt to make it... well, we'll give it a try. We'll give it a try. At any rate, there are a lot of heavy lift vehicles that are going to be potentially in our future. However, that's not the end of the issue. For example, the question comes about when? When is this heavy lift vehicle that we see over on the screen going to be into our future? That's only one of the questions, and it depends on who you ask as to what answer you will get. Some people who are responsible for writing budgets and so forth, plans will say 2016. And if you ask the NASA people, they will usually say, well, that's what's on the books. However, we aren't going to be able to have it ready by that date. And more than that, we aren't going to have the money to pay for it by that date. But the government will say, I'm sorry, it's on the books. You're obligated to provide this to us by 2016. Well, that's a nice obligation to make, but it's like an obligation for your house or your car. If you don't have the money in the bank, they may not get the obligation completed. And so there's problems with some of the issues about heavy lift vehicles. And so when is certainly one of those. And the other important thing, I think, is for what purpose? What purpose are we going to use this magnificent vehicle that can hoist something 130, 160 tons into space? We certainly don't want to, in a way like space station, have a space station which has taken 20 years, roughly, or more, and some 50 to $100 billion to complete, and then
speak together with so many of our peers and colleagues in this rapidly changing industry. I don't really need I was going to introduce my father actually there as kind of part of my thing too. I was making sure, but you actually covered it pretty darn well, that even though we've now both flown in space, we have come to this with very different routes. You know, my father through what I'll call the original traditional methods, the only methods that existed at the time, and myself having grown up in and around this industry for so many years, but was told at a young age that I would be ineligible, and so therefore I devoted myself to finding alternative methods to pull off that dream, and ultimately pulled it off. So today we are going to talk to you a little bit about some of the goals and methods for human spaceflight. You know, where we've been, where we are, and how we might kind of continue to do this in the future. And so I'm going to first invite my father Owen to speak first. And here, for convenience.
Thank you, Richard. And very pleased to see Dr. Money at the podium here. I was not aware you were going to be available. Oops, that's the wrong spot. Maybe this will be a little better, Ken. But Ken and I worked together on Skylab, what was it, 30 years ago, started something like that. And so it's an opportunity to get back together. And if there's any way to lower the volume on this microphone, I think it'll be very helpful for all of us. And find all of a sudden we have shorted ourselves in terms of providing something to do in that magnificent laboratory. And so we need to be thinking about what is the purpose of providing this kind of a vehicle? What are we going to do with it once we have it, whether it's in 2016 or 2020 or whenever it does become available? So there are some issues involved with the kinds of things that we hear bandied about in the press. There are lots of things we can do with a vehicle like that, and we want to be thinking those at the same time. We're thinking about how do we provide the vehicle. We better be thinking about what are we going to do with it, for example, in low Earth orbit, if anything, certainly not to carry crew members back and forth. We don't want that vehicle for that purpose. But certainly for interplanetary voyages, could be to asteroids. And if we think a little further into interplanetary space, my argument would be that we ought to be thinking of things like Phobos and Deimos as moons of Mars rather than going to the surface of Mars. You may have be familiar with the work of Fred Singer, and I've known Fred Singer something like 40 years or so, and he's got a very interesting biography if you have a chance to take a look at it. But he was one of the first to, I think, to call it a PhD program. In other words, for Fred, it's the Phobos or Deimos program. And Phobos and Deimos has a number of very interesting aspects as a target for our first voyages to the vicinity of Mars. For example, the surface gravity on Mars is roughly, it's less than 1 milli-G. And with 1 milli-G, you can easily shove yourself off, and you need to be careful that you don't do it too hard, or else you might sail a little further away than you had thought. And so that's certainly one interesting thing about going there first. Great observatory for controlling robots on the surface of Mars. You don't have to worry about dropping into a deep gravitational well, including the atmosphere that Mars has. And so it's certainly an advantage to stop on Phobos and Deimos and do a lot of laboratory work. You can probably go outside very carefully and actually, perhaps tethered as a matter of fact, and bring back rocks on the surface of Phobos or Deimos, which are probably from the surface of Mars itself. And so if you want to study Mars, there's good reason to look on Phobos or Deimos first and do laboratory work while you're there, then communicate with ground in real time do the analysis of some of those rocks and lay your plans for the next steps while you're there. So Phobos and Deimos, I think, are two very good targets. Asteroids are certainly a target, and there are a number of those. But one other thing that I haven't mentioned has been studied at some length, but it does not, I think, get adequate sort of coverage in the press as a use for that kind of a vehicle, and that would be as a vehicle to carry nuclear machinery, could be the rocket, into space for use on transiting with crews all throughout the solar system. Now, there have been several suggestions of plasma engines. I think of one that Chang Diaz calls VASIMR, variable amplitude space, something I can't